Every Muslim is told that our religion is pure and only comes through the Prophet. If Islam is truly pure, every practice we do should be in the Quran. It should be unique. It should be clear. It should be different from the religions that came before it, right? Now, I'm not saying what follows is a proven conspiracy. History is messy and rarely written in stone, but the patterns? They are simply too perfect to ignore. Look at the facts. The 5 daily prayers, the backbone of our faith, don't appear anywhere in the Quran, but they do appear somewhere else. In a religion that existed long before Islam, Zoroastrians pray 5 times a day at the exact same times. The Quran doesn't name any, so why are we doing these? And it's not just prayer. Circumcision, stoning, and even banning gold for men aren't in the Quran either. If our most basic beliefs and rituals come from other religions, then what are we actually practicing? If you feel a bit of a shock right now, that's because you've been taught that Islam grew in a vacuum. But history tells a different story. When the early Muslims expanded, they didn't just walk into empty land. They walked into the massive high-tech Sassanid Persian Empire and the Christian Levant. Here's the part the mullahs never mention. The Arabs were soldiers, not bureaucrats. When they conquered Persia, they didn't actually run the empire. They stayed in garrison towns and left the local Persians in charge of the tax books, the courts, and the daily administration. They were the overseers, but the Persians were the ones running the engine. The evidence points to a logical result. When you leave the engine of your society in the hands of another culture for 200 years, their ideas are going to leak into yours. This suggests a slow, quiet takeover of the mind. Not to mention, many of those administrators likely had a heavy axe to grind against the army of nomads who defeated their empire. That tension between the Arab and the Persian influence is still visible today. Take the 5 daily prayers. In Zoroastrianism, these are called the Gahs. They happen at dawn, noon, afternoon, evening, and night. Does that sound familiar? The Quran is incredibly detailed about things like inheritance and divorce, yet when it comes to the most important ritual, it doesn't mention the times or how to perform this. Did God forget? He didn't. But we can reasonably infer that for the Persian converts running the new Islamic world, the 5 ritual prayers were simply what they had known for centuries. 5 felt more religious. It felt more complete. It's highly probable they brought this structure with them. They didn't change the Quran, but they used the Hadith to explain why these specific rituals were so important. This points to what we call mimetic competition. Think of it as a religious arms race. Imagine you were a Muslim scholar in the year 800, constantly dating Christians and Jews. If the Christians had a story about a savior returning to earth and the Muslims didn't, the Muslims looked weak. The evidence suggests that to have bragging rights in the streets of Baghdad, the mullahs felt the need to match the features of their rivals. That is likely how we got the return of Jesus and the story of the Dhat. The Quran says Jesus died or was raised, and it never says he's coming back to fight a giant monster. That looks like a pure copy and paste from Christian folklore. It seems they didn't want to be the only kids on the block without an end times hero. We see this same pattern in our laws. The Quran is very clear about adultery. The punishment is 100 lashes. But traditional Sharia says we must stone people to death. Stoning is found in the Jewish Torah, not the Quran. This suggests the early scholars were so desperate to show that Islam was tougher than Judaism that they were willing to overlook the Quran. They even told a story about a verse of stoning being eaten by a goat. The pattern points to a desire to prove they were the true heirs to the prophets by being even more strict than the people who came before them. Even the things we wear were likely influenced by this rivalry. Most Muslim men believe wearing gold or silk is a major sin. You won't find that banned in the Quran. In fact, the Quran says that the adornments of God are for the believers. The historical evidence points to Roman and Persian laws. In those empires, gold and silk were symbols of the soft elite. We can reasonably infer that early leaders banned these things to create a new warrior identity. They wanted their men to look tougher and more disciplined than the rulers they replaced. Over time, this cultural fashion choice was turned into a divine law. The same goes for circumcision. It is a famous Muslim trait, yet it is completely absent from the Quran. The Quran says God created you in the best of forms. Circumcision was a Jewish covenant. But because the early community lived side by side with Jews, they likely adopted the practice to fit into the local definition of what a holy person looks like. They didn't want to be the uncircumcised outsiders. They wanted to belong to the lineage of Abraham. So it appears they took the ritual, even though the book didn't ask for it. This impulse is even suggested in the Hadith itself. Take the story of the Dhat Anwat. The early Muslims saw pagans hanging swords on a sacred tree, and they asked the Prophet to make a lucky tree for them too. They wanted the same rituals the other guys had. The Prophet's response was a warning. You are following the ways of those who came before you. This story is a smoking gun. It shows that the human brain craves the tangible and the familiar, and nothing is more tangible than the Kaaba itself. We are told the Kaaba is unique, but historical evidence shows the cube-shaped stone shrines were the standard architecture of Arabian paganism. There were dozens of them, from the red Kaaba to the Kaaba of Najran. Even the rituals circling 7 times and kissing a stone were practiced by pagans long before Islam. The Hadith even mentions a famous one in Yemen called the Yemeni Kaaba. If you go to Iran today, you can still see the Kaaba of Zoroaster, the Kaaba of Zoroaster. This suggests the cube was simply the standard shape for a temple in that part of the world. The Quran never tells you to kiss a stone. We can reasonably infer that by keeping the cube and the stone, early leaders made it easy for pagan tribes to join. They didn't have to change their habits. They just had to change the name of the god they were bowing to. It was a brilliant move for power, but it suggests the pure religion of the Quran was tethered to the very idols it was sent to replace. The result is a religion that feels like a bureaucracy, full of red tape, rather than a message of liberation. We've traded the simple guidance of the Quran for a maze of rules about which foot to use in a bathroom, or how long one's beard should be. The evidence points to these being cultural imports designed to create a superior identity. We have to ask ourselves, are we following the book, or are we following a patchwork quilt of ancient Pagan, Persian, and Roman traditions? The similarities are too perfect to be a coincidence. It's time to stop looking at the add-ons and start looking at the source. It claims to be fully detailed. If a practice isn't in there, it's not because God forgot. It's because it was never meant to be there in the first place.